Hello and welcome to my workshop. So we finished up with the bed for the Dodge Power Wagon. Now it's time to get onto the cab. This is going to be a crew cab and I'm really excited to get one built, so let's get started. So I'm starting out here just taking some MDF and gluing it together, getting it ready to make this shape for the back panel. I draw the lines on the MDF so I can use a sander to work slowly down to those lines. Then I can transition between the two and get the final shape. Sometimes it's hard to see that these panels and vehicles have a taper from side to side. It's often very slight, but it really does lend a lot to the look. I'm just taking some measurements here to figure out where I need to cut a recess in for the back window. In the past, I've cut this window section out completely and just left a hole, but I found it's easier to just cut a line around and then the plastic will dip in and give me a nice place to cut. Most of the cut is with this small saw blade using the rotary tool. And then the cleanup is with a really small end bit for the rotary tool before I put some CA glue to harden up the area. So the next thing is to get this piece glued up and then cut down like I did for the back panel. I find it better to make one panel at a time and then work off that panel to move forward versus trying to make several and hope they fit together. So the trick to this is to make the lines on these panels and then carefully sand back, and then before you start getting the transition set up to make it look more like the accurate panel in the truck. So I had to pick a spot where I wanted the side piece of this to end. And so I just chose somewhere down the window that matched up with the panel I have and carved that section in much like I did with the back window. One of the things I like to do is use a CA glue to harden up the MDF. once I get most of the material cut out of the way. And that just lets me get a better sanded edge, coming back with rotary tools and sandpaper. The transition between the two pieces of plastic, I'm gluing on a piece of 40 thousandths thick styrene so that I can have overlap between the joints. Before I get the whole thing glued together, I want to try to get as much of this shape cut out as possible. I'm taking the solvent glue here to soften up the plastic before pushing it together on the edges. Before you do that, you really do want to make sure you get those edges perfectly lined up with some light sanding to make sure that those edges are going to bond well with the solvent. And once the plastic starts to harden up a little bit and the piece starts to seem like it wants to grab, you want to take some CA glue from the back side, and it does two things. It kind of holds it in place like a clamp, and it also adds as a backer. So the same process is used to create the side panels as the rear and the top. Just need to glue the panels together and start making the window openings symmetrical to each side and accurate to the drawing. At this point, the model is not very stable, so you really have to be careful not to put too much pressure. But the more pieces go onto it, the more structure you have and the more stable it becomes. So this is the process that follows the piece coming out of the mold. So I just come around the edges and cut away the extra material. Then I start to mark up where I want to make the cuts. It's hard to see, but there is a tiny bump caused by the recess cut out for the windows. This is marked out and then cut with a razor. When you're making these molds, you really have to have a lot of careful measurements, going back and forth, getting this thing set up right according to your reference material, and just making sure the thing looks accurate when you're actually holding it in your hand. So this is a two-part filler called Dolphin Glaze. It's admittedly a strange name, but it works very well. There are very few air bubbles, and if mixed properly, it self-levels. So this will give you a nice transition between the glued together panels. So I usually take a 120 grit sandpaper to get the area knocked down, and then go back with a 220 grit to finish it up before putting on the primer. You do have to be a little careful with this, because if you don't mix it properly or have enough hardener, then it essentially would not harden up, and there'll be areas that'll stay soft, and it just won't sand well. You'll end up clogging up your sandpaper, and you might end up having to kind of cut it off or scrape it off the plastic. So what I'm doing here is trying to make a pattern out of styrene that I can use to mark up both sides of the truck where I need to cut the fender walls out. I was pretty lucky with this truck in that I had built a previous truck with the same fenders front and rear that I was able to reuse for making this one. It seems like Dodge had pretty similar fenders and a lot of similar parts across multiple years. So what I did here was a little different than normal. I actually bolted the fenders on. And I think this really turned out great, able to help me work out through the process of getting the front correct without having the fenders constantly in the way. Once I was done, I was able just to glue those in place and leave the bolts in there. It really does add a lot of extra strength. One of the things you have to do when drilling holes is really pay attention to where you're going. I wasn't careful enough here, and I drilled right into the seam between the two panels. It's simple enough to take care of, just a rotary tool. Cut the area down till it's flush so the nut can go flat against the panel. Next up is the radiator cowl, and I'm just using MDF again, sanding it down, and then using a Dremel Multimax tool to do some of the final sanding. Yeah, eventually there will be an opening for a radiator. Like I did with the windows, I didn't want to cut that completely out. First of all, it would weaken the mold. And second of all, it makes it more difficult to get out. Here you can see what the part looks like right after it comes out of the vacuum form table. You just start to cut away most of the material and then keep cutting down until you finally get to that edge of the part. I use CA glue on the edge to harden it up to MDF, because when you're using that razor blade, if you don't, the razor blade just really cut right through that MDF and you can really damage your mold. I wanted to keep all the parts in alignment, so I waited to cut out the center section for the radiator until I had most of the structure in place. So these are axial lights. They're from a light kit, and the other marker lights are 3D printed ones I designed, which hold a small axial round lens on the front and back. The last pieces are the hood and cowl section. These are made by cutting down large blocks of MDF and carefully marking them off the existing panels. Here I'm using a 3D printed part which has louvers cut into both sides. Then aluminum is placed between the panels. The vise and dead blow hammer are used to deform the aluminum into the shape of the louvers. The panels are designed so there's just enough room for the aluminum to take shape between both sides. The result gives a flat panel with 6 louvers. Originally, both panels for the hood were slated to be open, but I decided that was just going to make the front too weak, so I asked that just one panel would open. The little micro hinges were installed, and I used a tape to hold the panel in place until I get the CA glue to hold those hinges down temporarily. Long term, the hinges are going to be epoxied in place. As you can see, the hood opens in 2 sections, so there's 2 sets of hinges. The last thing to do once you have the truck in its final shape is to cut your panel lines. I'm doing this with the Tamiya scribe tool. The whole front end is good and solid, so I'm okay to cut out the section for the radiator and recess it back a bit. Essentially, it's just a little box that doesn't have a front on it. I'm just adding in the styrene, getting that in place, and then just pressing it back into the radiator opening. Once the edges are filled and sanded back, it will look like one piece. So here I'm using a little 1/4 round styrene to make the drip rail over both doors. I'm also using 1/2 round here to make the window trim that goes around the front and rear window. This has been a fun project and I'm very happy with how it turned out. I'm really looking forward to some exciting projects coming up. Until then, we'll see you on the rocks.